The betting pools had been open for 6 standard rotations. 6 rotations. That is how long it took for 342 registered species across the Velthari Syndicate to place their wagers on exactly how fast one human named Dax Korvell would die inside the Grivok hunting ground, not if, how fast. The distinction was considered so obvious that the event coordinators had not even bothered listing survival as an option on the betting interface. There was no box to check for, quote, "The hairless mammal somehow survives." That would have been like listing, "The sun rises from the west tomorrow," as a serious meteorological forecast. Ridiculous, embarrassing, a waste of interface space. My name is Prethulo, and I am a certified odds analyst for the Velthari Syndicate Wager Bureau, Sector 9 Division. I have been doing this work for 41 years. I have seen creatures dropped into the Grivok hunting ground before, several in fact. A Korvan warrior, which is a species whose lower jaw can crush reinforced durasteel plating, lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. A Sornathi brute, which stands at nearly 4 meters tall and has 6 arms specifically evolved for tearing things apart, lasted 7 minutes and 3 seconds. That remains the record. To this day, that Sornathi holds the gold standard for longest anything has ever survived the Grivok hunting ground without being immediately obliterated. Dax Korvell lasted considerably longer, but I am getting ahead of myself. Let me explain how this spectacular disaster began. It started, as most spectacular disasters do, with someone being deeply, catastrophically arrogant. His name was Velk Oruun, and he was the sort of creature who wore his wealth in layers. Literally, he had 7 decorative mantles draped across his primary thorax, each one representing a different financial conquest. Velk Oruun had made his fortune in what polite society called exotic specimen trading, and what impolite society called kidnapping sentient beings and selling them to rich people for entertainment purposes. The Syndicate tolerated him because he was extraordinarily profitable and had 17 senators in his back pocket. Dax Korvell had been acquired on a routine scouting mission to a mid-tier planet in the outer spiral, a world called Earth. Our scouts described it as a, quote, "damp, biologically aggressive rock orbiting an unremarkable yellow star." The planet had no hyperspace capability, no energy shielding, no plasma weaponry. Their most advanced military vehicles ran on, and I want you to appreciate how primitive this is. Controlled chemical combustion. They burned ancient compressed organic matter to move around. It was, from a technological standpoint, adorable. The human, this Dax Korvell, had been scooped up from a mountainous region on the northern continent. The scout drones reported he had been alone carrying a backpack, wearing layers of synthetic material and moving on foot through an area of extremely low temperature and high elevation. They assumed he was lost. They assumed he was struggling. They assumed, given that he was a small, soft-bodied, unarmored primate with no visible weapons, that he would be a manageable specimen. 3 of the 4 scout drones that approached him came back with damage reports. The Syndicate filed that detail under irrelevant anomaly and moved on. Velk Oruun acquired Dax Korvell for a modest sum, transported him to the holding facilities at Grivok Station, and announced a grand entertainment event. The Grivok hunting ground was, in Velk's words, the most prestigious testing arena in the known systems. It was a contained biome approximately 40 kilometers in diameter, filled with predators, environmental hazards, traps of both mechanical and biological origin, and something called a Vorruk, which I am told is what happens when nature decides to stop playing around and start making philosophical statements about mortality. A Vorruk, for those uninitiated, is approximately the size of a small building. It has no eyes. It does not need eyes. It tracks heat, vibration, chemical signatures, and apparently, from the research team's best guess, what can only be described as spite. It has never not killed something in the hunting ground, not once, ever. In recorded history, the betting pools opened. I, Prethulo, certified odds analyst, placed the following categories for public wager. Category A, time of death, 0 to 3 minutes. Payout ratio, 4 to 1. Reasoning, the ground-level predators near the insertion point were numerous and fast. Most specimens never made it past the first kilometer. Category B, time of death, 3 to 10 minutes. Payout ratio, 8 to 1. Reasoning, if the human somehow avoided the initial swarm, The mid-ground terrain was laced with sink mud pits and trigger wire flash traps. Even the Korvan warrior had lost 2 limbs to the flash traps before the predators finished the job. Category C, time of death 10 to 30 minutes. Payout ratio 20 to 1. This was considered the "he actually tried" bracket. Very optimistic, very unlikely. Category D, time of death 30 minutes to 1 standard rotation. Payout ratio 100 to 1. I put this in mostly as a formality. Nobody expected to pay out on this category. Category E, Vorruk kill. Payout ratio 50 to 1. The Vorruk always got its meal eventually. This was less about if and more about when. There was no category F. There was no survives option. Looking back, that was our first mistake. The insertion was scheduled for the start of Grivok Station's entertainment cycle, when audiences from across the Syndicate could tune in via broadcast relay. Velk Oruun had arranged for 12 different camera drones to track the specimen throughout the hunt. He had hired a commentary team. He had sold promotional rights to 6 refreshment companies. There were decorative banners. There were banners, people, for a human. I watched the pre-event analysis from my office with mild professional interest and a hot cup of Ferran broth. My junior analyst, a young Thuvari named Sev, had bet on Category A with his entire week's discretionary credits. I told him that was bold but probably correct. The insertion bay opened. Dax Korvell stepped into the Grivok hunting ground. Now this is the part where the commentary team, the broadcast audience of roughly 4 million registered viewers, and every single odds analyst in the bureau expected things to go as planned. The human would look around, get confused, probably make some noise indicating distress, and then the nearest pack of Skrel hounds would handle the rest. It was a formula. It had worked hundreds of times. Instead, the first thing Dax Korvell did was stop walking. He stood at the insertion point, perfectly still, and turned his head slowly from one side to the other. The commentary team described this as the specimen surveying its environment, likely experiencing extreme fear. The audience reacted with pleased anticipation. The Skrel hounds, 7 of them, had already caught his scent and were moving through the undergrowth approximately 300 meters to his left. Then Dax Korvell did something that made my Ferran broth go cold. He crouched down, pressed one bare hand flat against the ground, held it there for roughly 4 seconds, then stood back up. "What," said Sev, from across the office, "is he doing?" "I have no idea," I said. He was feeling vibrations. He was reading the ground with his hand, like a primitive seismic instrument. We found this out later from our xenobiological consultants, who explained with the sort of exhausted patience of someone who had been ignored their entire career that humans, in fact, had remarkable tactile sensitivity and had historically used ground vibration detection as a survival mechanism in environments with large predators. They had been telling us this for years. We had filed those reports under interesting but irrelevant. Dax Korvell felt the vibrations of 7 Skrel hounds moving through dense undergrowth 300 meters away. He turned to face them directly. He had not seen them. There was no possible visual line through the foliage. He turned and faced their exact position with the calm certainty of a creature that knew exactly where the danger was, and the commentary team went quiet for the first time in the broadcast. Then he started walking toward them. The audience, 4 million strong across the Syndicate, went absolutely silent. "He is walking toward the Skrel hounds," said the lead commentator, a 4-armed Drethalay named Puv, whose voice had the practiced smooth confidence of someone who had narrated 60 of these events. Puv sounded, for the first time in his career, genuinely uncertain. The Skrel hounds burst from the undergrowth at full sprint, all 7 of them in a coordinated fan formation. This was their standard hunting pattern. It was extremely effective. It had, to my knowledge, never once failed to work. Dax Korvell ran directly at the center of the formation, not away, not sideways, directly at the center. He hit the lead hound with his shoulder at full speed, which sent it tumbling sideways, used the momentum to spin, caught the second hound's lunge with his forearm in a way that redirected its trajectory into a third hound, and then there was about 8 seconds of footage that our analysis team would later spend 3 weeks studying frame by frame, because in those 8 seconds, Dax Korvell turned a coordinated ambush by 7 predators into what the xenobiological report politely described as a complete structural reorganization of the engagement in the specimen's favor. 4 hounds fled. 3 did not get up. Poov, the commentator, said nothing for 11 full seconds. 11. I counted. I have the broadcast log. Then, in a voice approximately 2 octaves higher than his professional baseline, he said, "The specimen has defeated the initial predator contact." The Category A betting pool collapsed. Sev looked at his empty credit account and made a sound I had not previously heard from a Thuvari. I believe it was the sound of someone watching their lunch credits dissolve in real time. Sev began. "Yes," I said, "but the Skrel hounds have never." "I know," I said. "How did he?" "I do not know," I said. "But I think we may have significantly underpriced Category D." Dax Korvell stood among the still forms of 3 Skrel hounds, looked down at them with an expression our behavioral analysis software categorized as neutral, possibly assessing, and then, methodically, he began collecting things. He took something from his backpack, which none of us had thought to confiscate because it had looked like camping gear, and began doing something to a long, straight branch he had just snapped from the nearest tree. "He is making a weapon," said Poov, in the reverent tone of someone witnessing a religious event they do not fully understand. "He already had a weapon," I said, to nobody in particular. "He just used it. His entire body is a weapon." I flagged the broadcast, updated the odds in real time, and sent an emergency bulletin to Velk Oruun's event management team suggesting they may want to, and I quote from my own message, "reconsider the structural assumptions underlying this entertainment product before it becomes financially catastrophic." Velk Oruun's response, which arrived 17 minutes later, was a single line of text that I will not repeat in full, but which communicated with great passion that I should concern myself with numbers and leave the entertainment industry to professionals. 40 minutes into the event, Dax Korvell had the Grivok hunting ground largely to himself. The broadcast was averaging 19 million viewers. The record for any Grivok event was 3 million. And somewhere, deep in the central zone of the hunting ground, something large and heatless and ancient shifted in its sleep, because the vibrations in the ground had changed. The prey was not running. The prey was not hiding. The prey was moving with purpose, leaving cleared terrain and improvised markers behind it, like it was not trying to survive the hunting ground. It was mapping it. And then the Vorruk woke up. The commentary team had nothing left to say. The audience had doubled again, and I, Preth Ulo, certified odds analyst for 41 years, quietly opened a new column in my spreadsheet and typed, with shaking hands, Category F, Survival, Payout Ratio to be determined. I had absolutely no historical data to work with. Nobody in the Velthari Syndicate Wager Bureau had ever issued a live odds correction mid-broadcast before. It simply did not happen. The odds were set before the event ran its course, the payouts were distributed, everyone went home. That was the process. That was 41 years of professional procedure, codified into bureau policy, laminated onto the wall above my workstation in Sector 9 Division, right next to the emergency contact list and the sign that said, "All wager disputes must be submitted in writing within 3 rotations." I issued 4 live odds corrections in the span of 2 standard hours. 4. My supervisor, a deeply unimpressed Grothali named Vetch, called me on a direct line after the second one and asked, with the measured calm of someone trying very hard not to scream, whether I had, quote, lost structural confidence in my own professional methodology. I told Vetch to turn on the broadcast. Vetch turned on the broadcast. Vetch did not call me again. Vetch just watched. Vetch watched with the rest of the 19 million, then 26 million, then 31 million viewers who had somehow heard, through the unstoppable mechanism of galactic word of mouth, that something deeply unprecedented was happening inside the Grivok hunting ground and that they absolutely needed to see it right now. Let me tell you what they were watching. Dax Korvell, the human acquired from a damp outer spiral planet for a modest sum and deposited into the most dangerous enclosed biome in the Syndicate, had been inside the hunting ground for 1 standard rotation and 14 minutes. He had not died. He had not even been significantly injured. He had, by the count of our 12 broadcast drones, which were now being operated by an increasingly frantic camera crew who kept losing him in the terrain, covered approximately 22 kilometers of ground, 22 kilometers, in 1 rotation. On foot, through a biome specifically designed to make movement lethal. He had avoided 6 separate trigger wire flash traps not by luck but by spotting them. Our trap engineer, a sullen specialist named Orc, who had personally installed every trap in the hunting ground and had never once seen a specimen spot one, watched the footage with his 4 arms crossed and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "He is looking at the wrong height." Orc paused. "No, he is looking at the right height. I installed them at the height of most species' lower visual field. He is shorter. His visual field is lower. He is seeing the trigger wires because he is the exact height to see them." This was, somehow, both a tremendous coincidence and completely infuriating. Dax Korvell had also, during this time, located a water source, constructed what our survival analysis team reluctantly classified as a functional short-range shelter using available organic materials, eaten something he had apparently identified as non-toxic from the local flora, which our xenobotanists confirmed was technically edible but which no other specimen had ever thought to assess for edibility because they were usually busy being chased, and fashioned what could only be described as a spear. A spear from a stick. On a world with plasma weaponry and void-capable starships, this human had built a stick with a sharp end, and based on the evidence left behind at 3 separate encounter sites, the stick with a sharp end was working. The audience had opinions about this. The broadcast comment relay, which proved the commentator had made the mistake of opening to public participation, was generating approximately 40,000 messages per minute. I will not summarize the full range of reactions except to say that they fell broadly into 2 categories. Category 1 was some variation of, "This is the most terrifying thing I have ever watched," and Category 2 was some variation of, "I have placed my children's educational savings on Category F and I need this human to succeed." I had, at this point, received 11 separate messages from Velk Oruun. The first 3 were angry, the middle 4 were demanding, the last 4 were something I had not previously witnessed from Velk Oruun in 41 years of professional interaction. They were nervous. Velk had structured the entire event financially on the assumption that payouts would be minimal, because the specimen would die quickly, because the specimen was a human, because humans were soft and unarmored and burned ancient rock fuel to travel and could not possibly survive the Grivok hunting ground. His event insurance was capped at Category C payouts. His promotional contracts included performance clauses tied to a maximum broadcast duration of 2 rotations. Dax Korvell was now in rotation 2. Velk was, to use a phrase I learned from our xenolinguistics team's Earth language database, in very serious trouble. But the financial catastrophe brewing in Velk's portfolio was at this particular moment a secondary concern, because the camera drones had just picked up something on thermal imaging in the central zone, and every analyst in the bureau, every commentator on the broadcast, every one of the 31 million viewers watching live, and one human named Dax Korvell all became aware of the same thing at roughly the same time. The Vorruk was moving. Now I want to be precise about what the Vorruk moving actually means, because the word moving does not adequately capture the experience. A mountain moves technically if you measure it over geological time. The Vorruk moving was not like that. The Vorruk moving was like watching a portion of the landscape decide it had somewhere else to be. It displaced undergrowth not by pushing through it but by rendering it irrelevant. The ground registered its movement as a continuous seismic event. Our broadcast drones, the ones closest to its path, began experiencing signal interference simply from the vibration. It was heading toward Dax Korvell at a speed our motion analysts described as inadvisably fast for something of that mass. Puv the commentator had given up on professional neutrality approximately 40 minutes ago. He was now just narrating with the raw honesty of a creature who had abandoned all pretense. "The Vorruk," he said in a voice that was almost a whisper, "has locked onto the specimen. This is the terminal phase. Whatever we have witnessed today, whatever extraordinary sequence of events has brought us to this moment, it ends here. Nothing has ever survived a Vorruk engagement. Nothing." He paused. "The human has stopped moving." Dax Korvell had stopped moving. He was standing on a slight ridge of elevated rock, approximately 2 meters high, in a clearing roughly 60 meters across. The Vorruk was coming from the north. The camera drone above showed Dax Korvell standing completely still, and then it showed him doing something with his hands, and our analysis software took 3 full seconds to categorize the behavior before returning the result. Specimen appears to be controlling breathing rate and heart rate deliberately. He was calming himself down, on purpose, in front of the Vorruk. "He can hear it," said Sev from across the office. Sev had given up pretending to do anything else and was fully watching the broadcast on his work terminal. He knew it was coming before the drones picked it up. He felt it through the ground, same as the Hounds. This was correct. We know this because Dax Korvell later told us, in a debrief interview that I personally attended and that I will carry in my memory until I cease to function, that he had felt the Vorruk in the ground, quote, "probably about 12 minutes before you lot figured it out." He said this with an expression that our behavioral software classified as mild amusement, which was the expression we would come to understand that Dax Korvell made when he found something funny but was too polite to actually laugh. The Vorruk entered the clearing. 31 million viewers held whatever their species used for breath. It was up close on the broadcast drones, even larger than the specifications suggested. Its surface was not exactly a surface. It was more like the idea of a surface, a shifting, dense boundary between the Vorruk and the rest of the universe, constantly adjusting. It had no eyes, as previously noted, but it oriented itself toward Dax Korvell with absolute precision. It tracked him. It knew exactly where he was. It began to close the distance between them. And Dax Korvell did not run. He picked up his spear. I heard Vetch, my supervisor, make a sound over the open office channel that I can only describe as a full emotional breakdown compressed into a single syllable. What happened next took 40 seconds. 40 seconds that I have replayed, professionally and personally, more times than I can count, and which I will now describe as accurately as the broadcast footage and subsequent physical evidence allowed us to reconstruct. Dax Korvell did not fight the Vorruk the way any species we had ever studied would fight something that large. He did not stand his ground and attempt to inflict damage from a fixed position. He moved constantly, not in retreat, but in a rotating pattern that kept him in the Vorruk's blind zone, which was a structural feature of the Vorruk's sensory system that our xenobiology team had documented extensively and which had never mattered before because no specimen had ever lived long enough to exploit it. He used the elevated rock behind him. He used the angle of the terrain. He used the spear not as a weapon in the conventional sense but as a probe, testing the Vorruk's reactive zones, mapping where it flinched, where it did not, where its attention shifted. He was learning it in real time, in 40 seconds. He was conducting field research on the most dangerous organism in the Grivok hunting ground, while it was actively trying to remove him from the universe. Then he found the spot. Every organism, no matter how large, no matter how evolved, has a spot, a structural vulnerability that exists not because evolution failed, but because perfecting every square centimeter of a being the size of a small building is simply not something natural selection gets around to. Our xenobiology team knew the Vorruk's spot. It was documented, it was in the file that nobody had ever needed because nothing had survived long enough to use the information. The spot was a sensory cluster on the Vorruk's lower anterior section, tucked beneath an overhang of its own mass, approximately the size of a serving plate, and it was sensitive, extraordinarily sensitive. Stimulating it caused a cascading neural disruption that would, in theory, disorient the Vorruk for somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes. Dax Korvell found it in 40 seconds of contact without ever having read the file. He hit it with the spear. The Vorruk made a sound that the broadcast audio team would later describe in their technical report as a frequency event that briefly compromised 3 of our 12 drone units, and then it did something it had in recorded history never done before. It retreated. The Grivok hunting ground went quiet. Pove, the commentator's microphone, picked up, clearly and without any ambient noise to cover it, the sound of Pove himself crying, not dramatically, just quietly, in the way of someone who had watched something that rearranged their entire understanding of how the universe worked. 31 million viewers became 47 million viewers in the next 6 minutes, as the clip of the Vorruk retreating spread across every broadcast relay in the Syndicate. I know this because my bureau tracking system, which was absolutely not designed for this volume, crashed twice, and then Dax Korvell did the last thing. He walked to the nearest camera drone, looked directly into its lens with those flat, forward-facing predator eyes that we had categorized as non-threatening, likely vestigial, and he said something. He said it calmly in his own language, and it took our translation systems 11 seconds to process it. The translation came back. It said, "Are you going to open the door now, or do I need to find it myself?" Velk Oruun opened the door. The extraction team that went in to retrieve Dax Korvell came back with more information than they were prepared to process. He was uninjured in any way that required treatment. He was tired and hungry by his own assessment, in roughly that order of priority. He asked for water first and food second and explained the third and fourth items on his list as, quote, "a conversation with whoever is in charge, and then a way home." Velk Oruun, who had by this point calculated his financial exposure and arrived at a number that had made him briefly non-functional, attempted to avoid the conversation with whoever is in charge by sending a legal representative instead. The legal representative returned 20 minutes later and told Velk, in a hushed and urgent voice, that the human was, quote, "not accepting the representation arrangement," and that Dax Korvell had said, with what the representative described as completely reasonable pleasantness, that if Velk did not come in person within the next few minutes, Dax would begin advising the 47 million broadcast viewers who were still watching, still live, on exactly which Syndicate charter provisions Velk Oruun was in violation of, as he had apparently spent portions of his time in the hunting ground reviewing the publicly accessible Syndicate legal code on a small device he had been carrying in his backpack. He had been reading Syndicate law on a handheld device while surviving the Grivok hunting ground. Velk went in person. "I do not know exactly what was said in that meeting because I was not present, but I know the outcome because it became a matter of public Syndicate record within one rotation." Velk Oruun paid a settlement figure that our financial analysis team described as structurally significant, returned Dax Korvell to his homeworld with a formal apology that was witnessed by 2 Syndicate arbiters, and agreed to a set of operational restrictions on his specimen trading enterprise that effectively ended it as a profitable venture. Additionally, as a direct consequence of the broadcast and the subsequent public firestorm involving 47 million very vocal opinions, the Velthari Syndicate issued Emergency Classification Revision 7 Tau, which reclassified humanity from Category 3 pre-spaceflight, non-threat, open acquisition status to Category 9 extreme caution, no contact without full diplomatic protocol. Do not under any circumstances place in an enclosed environment with anything you are not prepared to lose. Category 9, we had 5 other species in Category 9. 3 of them had void-capable fleets. 1 of them had a weapon capable of sterilizing a planet. The 5th was a fungal network that had once consumed an entire station from the inside out. The humans were added with a footnote that read, and I am quoting directly from the official revision document because I helped write it, "classification based not on technological capability, but on demonstrated adaptive lethality, environmental problem-solving under extreme duress, and a documented capacity to treat existential threats as logistical obstacles rather than terminal events. Recommend further study. Do not repeat the Grivok incident." I framed that footnote. It hangs on my wall above the laminated bureau policy and below the emergency contact list. Sev, my junior analyst, who had lost his week's discretionary credits on Category A, submitted a formal request to be reassigned to the newly created Human Observation Division, which the Bureau established 3 rotations after the incident to, in the division director's words, "get ahead of whatever comes next." I approved the request. The division currently has 64 analysts. We are hiring. As for Dax Korvell, the last intelligence report we received, which came through a surveillance relay approximately 8 rotations after his return, indicated that he had given a brief interview to a local information outlet on Earth in which he described his experience in a sentence that our translation team rendered as, "Honestly, it was a rough camping trip, but I have had worse." 47 million viewers. A Vorruk that retreated, a Category 9 classification that is now permanently attached to every human being on that damp outer spiral rock. And 1 human who considered the whole ordeal a slightly rough camping trip. I have been a certified odds analyst for 41 years. I set prices on outcomes for a living. I quantify risk. I assign probability to events across hundreds of species, dozens of biomes, thousands of variables. I have not touched the odds on humans since. Nobody has. Because here is the thing about humans, the thing I wrote in my final report, the thing I have said to every analyst who has come to me since asking how we missed it, how we got it so catastrophically, expensively, historically wrong. We looked at what they did not have. No armor, no natural weapons, no enhanced sensory biology, no void travel. We looked at the list of things they were missing and we called that data. We called it analysis. We called it professional assessment. We never once looked at what they did with what they had. That was our mistake. That was the most expensive mistake in Syndicate history, and it cost us 47 million witnesses, one shattered Vorruk record, and whatever dignity Velk Oruun had left, which was, by the final accounting, not very much. Not very much at all.